Welcome to The Origin of Things, or TOOT for short. A short format podcast where I give you the origins, the backstories, slightly dramatized but 100% true, of things that you know, love and use. I reveal what I'm talking about only at the very end, keeping you, the listener, guessing. Or so I hope. In previous seasons, I've taken you through the stories that have led to some of your favorite brands and the unlikely stories and accidents that got us there. If there's a lesson from this podcast, let it be that great things can come from the most unexpected of places and sometimes even mistakes. I am your host, Deepak Gopalakrishnan, or as the world calls me, Chuck. The origins of that, another day. Let's move on to today's story. Not much is known of George Warren. The internet will tell you that he was a wealthy British shipping magnate from the 19th century, but that's about it. Dig a little deeper into British industrial history and you might find references to his company's role in the thriving England-USA trade and a few notes about the kind of boats he owned, but precious more about the man himself, not much. Indeed, the most interesting and significant thing about Mr. George Warren might have been his home. Being very wealthy, he built a private residence, a large mansion in the Gothic revival style with large gardens, ideal to play and get lost in. And at the entrance, two large red wrought iron gates bookended by sandstone pillars. And that is where our fascination with Mr. George Warren ends. For the home, which he'd built in 1870, was sold to another shipping magnate, Alexander Mitchell, in the early 20th century, who lived there till his death in 1927. Now, what happened after that was interesting. The house passed from Mr. Mitchell's widow to the Salvation Army, who repurposed the mansion as accommodation for 40 disadvantaged children. Initially set up for girls, boys were introduced in the 1950s. The original Gothic home was finally demolished in 1973 to make way for something more modern and, safer. According to the good folk at Hotels.com, and I quote, the multifunctional space also hosts the Steps to Work program for young adults with learning disabilities to help them gain vital employment and socialization skills, end quote. Wonderful. The resident kids, no doubt, enjoyed the lush, spacious wooded gardens to run around and make merry. In fact, they were not the only ones who did that. The lawns of this mansion, now an orphanage, attracted a lot of the local kids. On occasion, the property would open its famous iron gates to the community during events, and on other occasions as well. And kids being kids would just scale the walls. Among them was a local resident, John. He loved hanging out with the kids in the gardens and was so notorious for sneaking in that the authorities had to ring up his aunt, who was by now fed up with this young miscreant who she had to care for. She even tried to tell him that the authorities would hang him if he jumped into the gardens again. Alas, no avail. John kept breaking the rules. And it's a good thing that he did, too. For John wasn't just breaking rules when it came to private spaces. He was also breaking rules in the recording studio. Doing things that had never been done before to create all kinds of soundscapes and aural experiences. Pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Add a generous dose of drugs and nostalgia to studio experimentation, and you get a potent combination that would change the course of popular music over the next few decades. John reminisced about his time playing in this park, scaling the wall and hanging out with the kids, living in a dreamlike world. So much so that his writing partner felt compelled to create a rival composition about his childhood experiences not too far back, referencing a barbershop, a banker on the corner, a fireman with an hourglass, all under blue suburban skies. Both absolute classics by a music group at the height of their powers and influence. It fascinates me as to how many of the Beatles songs were actually just about their own experiences and lives and small things that happened to them rather than grand concepts of philosophy. Perhaps there's a lesson there. Perhaps we should all slow down and smell the roses. Oh, did I say roses? I meant strawberries. Strawberries that grew in the garden that John used to love encroaching on, despite his Aunt Mimi's desperate threat that he would be hung. 20-odd years later, he would write the line, "Nothing to get hung about." And that's the story. The land that housed the mansion that George built, which continues taking care of disadvantaged kids, is called Strawberry Field. May it last forever. And see you next week with another musical episode of The Origin of Things. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us and all our shows on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com. You can also follow us on social media. We are at IVM Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to reach out to me, that's Chuck_Gopal on Twitter and Chuck of All Trades on Instagram. All links in the show notes of this episode. See you next week.